Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I'm conscious that I'm the final speaker at the end of a 3-day conference, so I suspect you're all pretty exhausted, so I will try and be brief. And I haven't got any slides, so you'll have to listen rather than look at pictures. I'm 1 day into hosting the Alzheimer's International Conference of 1,500 delegates at the Excel Centre, and I know how demanding it is, a conference, so I'm going to be gentle on you, but hopefully thought-provoking. And I realise I'm sort of preaching to a converted audience for telehealth and telecare. So I'm going to talk about some of the successes, not just from my experience at Alzheimer's Society, but also what I picked up as chair of National Voices, which is the umbrella body of 150 social care and health charities that tries to bring together a collective view on what we want to see developing in health and social care. So it's not just going to be about innovating for an ageing society. Some of the things that work, but some of the sort of cautionary notes that I want to leave with you about some of the concerns we have about how it goes forward. And Paul Burstow, the minister who I know spoke to you earlier at this conference, was reported as saying that there's a fantastic customer base of 3 million, I believe he said. Just think what a market of this size can do in terms of innovation and economies of scale. Now, I think Paul Burstow is a breath of fresh air in many ways in terms of government ministers who actually knows a lot about what he's talking about and is very committed to bringing about change and development. But I have to take issue with him around some of the language he was doing there, of talking about a customer base and talking about the economies of scale, which I'll come back to in a moment, and a market. And I think my message has to be to you that what we're talking about is people's lives, patients, carers, rather than customers and a market. So there's a slight concern that we let the business side take over from the human side. And that would be my starting point. I think telehealth and telecare can make a difference, but it's not the answer. And I suspect from what I've heard, talking to people just in the tea break, that's been a sort of theme probably more this year than at the first conference last year, where there was a slightly sort of more gung-ho attitude to this being the Holy Grail. I think there's a feeling now that it is part of the answer, but not the whole answer. So I welcome that. I think there are some real opportunities with telehealth and telecare from a patient perspective. It can make things more accessible. It can alert staff when you need them, and without you having to go anywhere to do that. It can tie closely into a personalisation agenda, but there's a downside on that I'll come back to. It can lead to independence for people in their own homes, and as we've just heard, how many people want to end up in a nursing home? And from the Alzheimer's Society perspective, 2/3 of the residents in nursing homes are there with dementia, and they're probably there because often it's the carer who collapsed in exhaustion rather than the condition of the person with dementia getting particularly worse. So what can we do to support both the patient and the carer more effectively? And I think telecare and telehealth can make an enormous difference. It can reduce hospital admissions, and again, from the Alzheimer's experience, 1 in 4 adults in hospital are there with dementia. They're not there because they've got dementia, but they're there with dementia, often through falls, through catching an infection, whatever the reason, as a frail elderly person with dementia, and they stay there longer than anybody else. There was some research done by the Health Foundation last year that if you reduced the stays by people with dementia in hospital by 1 day, and on average they stay 3 to 4 days longer than anybody else for the same reason of admission, you would save £100 million at a stroke. So there's an economic incentive as well as a health incentive to reduce hospital admissions. And again, I think telehealth and telecare can make a difference. And as I said, I think it can reduce the stress on carers enormously and make a big difference. So let me just give you 1 or 2 examples of where I think it can make a big difference. I was very impressed by the experience in Birmingham. And Birmingham City Council are investing something like £15 million over the next 3 years in telecare. And I think that's a lesson to actually realise that you do need to invest money in it, and it's not a quick saving. One of the challenges, I think, in the health service is when you talk to the QUIP programme and you talk about investing to save, people's ears shut and they're not really interested. But I think telehealth and telecare are an area of invest to save rather than instant savings within 1 year. Birmingham, as I say, are investing, and there's a story of Carol from Sheldon, who I'll tell you about, who was a very active person, who was even was trialled for the England netball team in the past, diagnosed with MS in 2002, followed by epilepsy in December 2010. She lives with her sister and has other family members nearby, frequently tends to fall without warning due to a combination of her condition and the use of walking aids. And she had telehealth installed in December 2010, telecare rather. And this was what she said. She said, "It was the young lady from Adults and Communities, or Adult Social Care, who comes to help me that mentioned it first. My GP then agreed I needed more care in the house and referred me. The lady that came to demonstrate the kit was brilliant. She went through it stage by stage. I remember thinking, I want this, so hurry up and put it in. The thought that there's something always there is a great comfort. If I press this pendant now, I know they'd answer. I feel so much safer, and it certainly gives my family peace of mind. My sister works full-time and used to check up on me constantly throughout the day. She doesn't have to do that now." So a very clear example of achievement. Another one which I really like was Mr. Ramsey, who's an 80-year-old and has Alzheimer's disease. He regularly was leaving his home at night to try to go to work, and his family were increasingly concerned for his safety. Neighbours also had been alerting social services about the need to make sure that he's kept safe. Initially, a PIR linked to a light box was used to help Mr. Ramsey. This was fitted to the inside of his external door, and when he approached the door, the beam was broken, illuminating a message on the box saying, "Don't go out, it's night time." Using a time switch, the light box was programmed by his home help to come on during the hours of darkness. The wording on the message was changed regularly, although the meaning stayed the same, to make sure he didn't start taking it for granted and stop noticing it. The intervention has been successful, although it had not worked, other techniques could have been used. So again, an example of something very simple that transformed the ability. And in Mr. Ramsey's case, I know from having met his home help, haven't met him, but met his home help, he probably would have ended up in a nursing home had that not been made available. There's a woman called Jennifer, who is actually a GP, funnily enough, who was diagnosed with dementia after 8 years of trying to get a diagnosis. Even as a GP, she finally got diagnosed. And she's an example of how technology can reduce social isolation. So she told me the story when I went to see her in Bristol and about her diagnosis. And I said, "Well, what's life like now?" And she said, "Well, I've discovered Facebook." And this is somebody in her 70s. And I said, "Oh, interesting." And she said, "Yeah, I've never used any technology like that before. But when you think about it," she said, "it's ideal because I can have a conversation in my own time. I can stop and start it when I want. There's a picture of the person I'm talking to. There's a biography of the person, a record of the previous conversation. I can actually follow it in a way as a person with dementia that I can't follow a face-to-face conversation." So a very simple example of technology making a difference. A similar one is we've set up a chat room called Talking Point at the Alzheimer's Society. And in the space of a couple of years, we've now got over 15,000 people participating in it. And it is a moderated chat room where people with dementia can talk and support to each other. An interesting challenge, I think, and this Congress is a really good example of recognising that, is that this is global. So we, as the Alzheimer's Society in the UK, set it up. But what's happening, and I was looking at it yesterday, is that the participants are from anywhere in the world. So there was a thread yesterday of somebody who was talking about baking cakes and how he found that therapeutic, and he put on a picture of the cakes he baked. And in the course of, I think, 6 people, there were 2 from England, 1 from elsewhere in Europe, 1 from Hungary, 1 from Indonesia, and I think 1 from the United States. And that was in the course of about an hour and a half of conversation happening there. So we need to recognise that, and we have, for example, in the Alzheimer's Society, done that by recruiting moderators from around the world. So at whatever time of day or night people need support, there's a moderator who's awake and able to contribute. And one of the challenges, and where, again, telecare and telehealth can make a big difference, is the ability to do things in the middle of the night, where otherwise you wouldn't be able to get support. So that's another great example. And the final example of success that I talk about is the Design Council work. And again, it ties up with some of the things I know have been talked about. We launched a call for action by the Design Council with some government money from BIS last year, where they put up, I think it was £325,000 for people to come up with creative designs on dementia. And what was interesting was the Design Council actually really took this to heart and motivated a design community way beyond the health community. I mean, these were people who hadn't thought about doing anything on health at all. They've come up with 5 programs that are being funded, and 2 of them very directly relate in. One which is a wristband with identity monitoring and alarm functions, which is much more accessible and much more portable and usable than the more clunky things that have existed before, and a lot of thought's gone into the design of it. So as before the technology was the driver, this is interesting, a design company have come up with something which is like a bit of jewellery, although it's got all the functionality of what was previously a rather heavy bit of electronic equipment that people were expected to carry around. The other one, which I really like, is something that hasn't got a name yet, they're just inventing it, but I would call it a scent clock, which is something that gives off an aroma at meal times to make you want to eat. Because one of the problems with people with dementia is that they don't eat, and they don't realise it's time to eat, and therefore, if they're, and 1/3 of people with dementia in the UK live alone at home, and they're not eating, and then they get ill. So this clock, actually, they've developed it, and it will trigger an aroma of something that you want to eat. Your 3-course dinner, or your toast and coffee, or whatever it is, and that will trigger you to go and think it's time to eat. So very exciting developments that technology can bring, and it's a lesson there about taking us beyond, as I say, ourselves into the wider community of people who are interested. So those are a couple of really good examples and a few case studies of where it makes a difference. But what I wanted to just draw a sort of slight warning note is some of the things that I think can go wrong. I think, as been clear at this Congress, the economic case is by far not made yet. I think it was Jennifer Dixon last week from the Nuffield Trust was saying that on the whole system demonstrator that it's very disappointing results in reducing emissions, and I gather at this conference there's been talk of a QALY of £88,000. Well, having come from the cancer community and talking from where I was in my previous job and the QALYs that would get drugs approved by NICE, an £88,000 QALY rather rules everything out. So I think there are some real challenges around the cost effectiveness of it, and we have to look in the current times about what is the best and most effective way of providing support. And at the end of the day, although technology can make an enormous difference, it does have its downsides. I've got 6 that I wanted to leave with you as my thoughts of things that can go wrong, and I've seen in my work at the Alzheimer Society and from talking to colleagues in National Voices. Firstly, there's unintended consequences. So you can develop a bit of technology that looks as though it's going to be wonderful, and everyone says, yes, isn't it marvellous? But when you actually start using it, given the fact that all people are different, and again in dementia is a classic example where no two people's needs are the same, it doesn't always work. Good example was a door alarm. So not like the example with Mr. Ramsey before. This is an alarm that would actually go off when you broke a beam when you went to the front door, and it said, don't forget to take your keys. Because what was happening is a lot of people were going out, leaving their keys in the house, and then not being able to get back in again. Sounds brilliant. What was happening with not everybody, and that's important, but with a lot of people with dementia, is they got freaked out because they thought there was another person in the house. So this voice, whilst it was meant to be helping them, alarmed them enormously. So unintended consequences is my first on the list. The second one is the whole issue of comorbidities. It's very easy to get into developing telehealth support around particular health issues, and people becoming very reliant and thinking it does more than it does. So you can have something around diabetes, which people over-rely on, and it can work very well for diabetes. So it's not me. Don't think it's me. Could be. Might have been me. Right. It was the minister. No, it wasn't. So comorbidities, the problem again from dementia, which is classic, is that actually, and this is rather frightening in 21st century Britain, only 40% of people with dementia get a diagnosis. So 60% of people with dementia don't get a diagnosis. And therefore, if you rely on telehealth and telecare to respond to what is diagnosed, you've got a danger of the dementia not being diagnosed. So you assume people have got an ability to use this to, say, monitor their diabetes, but because they've got dementia which is undiagnosed, maybe they can't use it. So a real concern there. Third one, which is an obvious point, but again, I've seen it, is, and we all know this from our personal experience, technology can fail. Things can go wrong. Power supplies can break. Batteries can run out. And again, with dementia, it's very difficult to get people to understand that always, even when you have warnings, even when you have lights. So technology can fail. Fourth one, is, and again we've seen this in some of the work we've been doing at Alzheimer Society, there's a chance of mis-selling, of selling products because they're profitable rather than because they're useful. We've just started a big program with South Bank University, and we're doing a program with Alzheimer Scotland at Glasgow University, which is retesting assistive technology products to make sure they really do what it says on the tin, because there's some of them that are being marketed which really don't make an enormous difference, and again can look good and lead people into difficulty. Fifth one is creating social isolation, and this is probably, these last two are probably my two biggest concerns. Japan is a great example where there is a lot of evidence now around the much acclaimed Japanese support system for elderly people, which basically dumps elderly people in a separate world, and you offload the responsibility for your elderly relatives into a largely impersonal care system, and that can leave people much more socially isolated. And a bit like the example, that's why I like the example of the lady from Sheldon in the West Midlands, where she said her daughter doesn't need to check up on her anymore. It's quite worrying if you think the technology makes people think they don't have responsibility for a family member that they had before. And the final one, and this came out of the work that I was doing for the Department of Health, chairing the working group on personalisation for the Social Care White Paper, there's a real risk, I think, of personal budgets being abused and misused. I think there's a chance of people being under-informed. There's a chance, and we had an example quoted to us in the working group of a local authority who said to a disabled person, we're going to give you a personal budget because we can't afford to support you, so you might as well have the problem yourself. So I think there is, which is a remarkable degree of honesty from the person who said that. I think there is a real danger that people, if they're left to their own devices, will, and Magda just referred to this, sort of download something with no advice and actually work on it and use it and spend their money on something that isn't really working. So it can't be a route to save money. It has to be a route to improve service. I think it's got a part to play, but it's not the answer. A couple of quotes that I was interested in was Sir John Oldham saying that you need to get the design of the care system right first and then consider putting in the kit. And I thought that was absolutely right, and I think that's where we would come from as patient organisations, that the kit is to support the care. The kit is to support the people, not substitute for the people, to enable the people to work better rather than to work without the people. Paul Burstow, again from his speech here, talked about the whole evolution of the health and social care system. And I don't know if he was feeling that he needed to say this because the House of Lords were voting on the health and social care bill at the time, but what I saw on the King's Fund website was that he said that we ended up with a confused, disjointed, fragmented mess, which I suppose was honest again. I don't think telehealth and telecare is going to solve that. If anything, it could add to the disjointed, confused and fragmented mess unless we get it right. So I guess my message is we want it to work. We've got some great examples of it working, but we need to tread cautiously. Thank you. Thank you very much.